Okay. So here's kind of where we left yesterday, right? So again, what we are going to focus today is this kind of sentences where you have a universal quantifier, all, and a negation. Okay, very, very famous structure because this is a typical structure that gives rise to scope ambiguity. So it's been studied in a lot of experiments, especially with the goal of investigating how children interpret these constructions. Okay, and once again, I would like to remind you that in the surface scope reading, this sentence means that, so for instance, all of the pirates don't have a beard means that no pirates have a beard, and it's only true in this kind of context. A same sentence with an Intrascope interpretation, when you switch the order of negation and the universal quantifier, would mean something like, not all of the pirates have a beard. We strongly suggest that some of them have, but it is logically compatible with the context where, in fact, no pirates have a beard. Hence, this interpretation is logically stronger than this interpretation. Okay? This is where we were last time. So, okay, right. So, because of this reason, right? If you want to run an experiment with the question of who is going to be able, or how frequently or how steadily do children, do patients derive the inverse scope interpretation, right? What is the context that you are going to use? This context, which is compatible with both interpretations, or this context, which is only compatible with inverse scope interpretation? If you want to see whether people are able to derive this interpretation, or they're willing to do it, or they do it automatically or frequently, whatever, by default, which is the context that you're going to choose in your experiment? If you can only choose one context, this one here, compatible with both, or this one here, only compatible with inverse scope? Anyone? Even in chat? Take your guess. No guess? Okay. So let me tell you a little bit more about this. Let's say that we are taking this context, okay, which is kind of the video that I showed you at the very first time. So let's take this context where no pirates have a beard, and let's present the sentence, all of the pirates don't have a beard. And then let's ask whether the puppet who uttered this sentence is right or wrong. And let's say that your participant says, yes, the puppet is right. It is true that all of the pirates don't have a beard, okay? By taking this context here, right? Now, if your participant says, yes, it is true that all of the pirates don't have a beard, do you know what kind of reading your participant had in mind? No, right?
No.
Thanks, Caro. No, because this is compatible with both contexts. So there is no way. I mean, okay, it's more selective for this interpretation in a way because this is really depicting the meaning of this interpretation. But how do you know that people just derived the inverse scope but still were happy with the logical compatible scenario? Okay. So this is not the right context to specifically investigate inverse scope. You have to pick this context because this is the one which is only true for the inverse scope interpretation, right? Is this clear?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So that's what people did. in a lot of experiments. They took this context and they developed some stories like the one that I showed you last time, and then I'm going to show you again, right? And then they tested this question: are children able to perform this operation of switching the scope of operators and quantifiers, and do they like to do that? And how is their interpretation pattern compared to the adults one, right? So in 2000, the very first experiments on this topic were done by Julian Musolino and Thornton and Crane, okay? And they found that basically children really, really struggle with the inverse scope. They really had a preference for surface scope, okay? Whereas adults prefer inverse scope. So they really found the split in their preferences, in their overt behavior. And then in some following experiments, Musolino and Leeds found that actually children can do inverse scope, at least in like 55% of trials, if there is a contextual bias or a contextual facilitation, if there is something in the context that makes this reading particularly salient, okay?
Does that have to do with pronunciation as well? Like if I told a child all of the pirates don't have a beard.
So in this experiment, they didn't really play with intonation, right? So their contextual manipulations, like they had different contexts, but basically in one of the experiments, they presented a sentence with overt not all before the critical sentence with all not. So something like, sorry, no. Wait, did I use all or not all? No, I think all. Like all of the cats or all of the pigs jumped in the hole, but all of the horses didn't jump over the fence. No, every pig jumped in the pond, but every horse didn't jump over the fence. Something like this. Okay. Now, sorry, I don't remember the details about this because they had actually several experiments on this. So maybe it's good if some of you wants to summarize all these experiments. I mean, one person, one experiment. Okay. So these are the papers that I'm gonna put in definitely in the pool. Okay. So I guess what they, so in one paper, they definitely introduced this kind of sentential context. And right, and in this paper, they did something like semantic priming, okay? Now again, unfortunately, I don't remember, but I can tell you if I have them here. Well, okay, let's chat about that later, okay? Let's keep that in mind. Right, but finally, in 2008, very interesting work by Gualmini and colleagues and Fox, and this Fox is the same of the guy of scope economy, okay? They said that, look, if you actually have a nice experimental setup where all the, they call them alternatives to the question under discussion. So all the possible answers to the question under discussion, if they're all salient in the context, like salient in the story, and if you utter the sentences with the proper intonation, the children are going to be able to do inverse scope. Okay, and this is a very interesting, very nice experiment. So I would really like someone to present this one. Okay, it's the experiment of the pizza boy. So what does it mean that the answer to the question and discussion is salient? So for instance, if you are if we are talking about the example of the horse jumping over the fence, it's like the question and discussion would be, for instance, who jumped over the fence, or how many horses jumped over the fence, or did every horse jump over the fence, or did this horse here jump over the fence? Did this horse jump over the fence, right? So depending on what the question and the discussion is, you might activate different alternatives, or you might focus, like put your let's say your attention also at the level of semantic processing on a certain set of alternatives, and that's going to facilitate or prevent you from deriving certain inferences. Okay, so yeah, that would be really nice to be presented by someone. Okay, so basically they found that yes, children can do inverse scope. And then in another paper, again by the group of Litz and Musolino, they found a split behavior. So they found this very puzzling result that younger children were were producing a high rate of inverse scope responses, like 81%, and then their performance dropped at 5 to 45% of inverse scope responses, and then it went up again in adulthood. They found a sort of a U-shaped behavior. Okay. So yeah, so a lot of strange results, right? Also conflicting results. So you know, I showed you this the last time, but again, I can give you a couple of refreshing notions. So in this experiment, they had, you know, this scene acted out by the experimenter with like 2 of the horses that managed to jump off the fence. The third horse didn't manage. The puppet would utter the critical sentence, every horse didn't jump over the fence. And the adults would say, yes, it is true, because this guy here didn't jump over the fence. Children would say, no, it is wrong, because these guys here managed to jump over the fence, right? So they interpret these results as saying children only access surface scope. If we assume that children always try to make the puppet statements true, if we assume that the charity principle holds, then we can conclude that they only access surface scope. But we already talked about this last time. What if children access more than one interpretation, and then for some reason they prefer the surface scope interpretation, right? So how can we know that they really access one interpretation, or that they access both interpretation, but they really have a preference for one of them? And this question applies to any kind of experiments that you would do with respect to using ambiguous sentences or ambiguous items or constructions that leads to ambiguity at the level of interpretation. Okay, is this clear? Is this sort of summary of what we chatted about already? Good. Right, so to sum up, what do we know? Do children access the infrascope interpretation? Yes, right? If we were like 20 years ago, maybe we would say, we don't know, no, this really, but now we can say yes. And which interpretation do they prefer? Do they have a preferred interpretation? That's not as clear, because in this experiment, it seemed that they have a surface scope preference. In these experiments, they had no preference. They were like 50-50. And in this experiment, they had an inverse scope preference, right? And you see, some of these experiments are even within the same study, right? So probably a smarter question to ask would be, what are the factors that influence their interpretation, okay? So is it prosody, for instance? We know from a very nice paper by this guy called Buring that you might know, the scope inversion conspiracy, right? That he had a very nice model about matching intonation patterns, so the so-called head contour in German, and scope interpretation. So he associated scope inversion with this kind of intonation profile, which I cannot really make, but would be something like alle Piraten haben nicht de Kuchen gegessen. Alle Piraten haben nicht de Kuchen gegessen. Or something like this. So it's called het because it goes down and then. Okay, sorry about that. But also, some other hypotheses suggest that it's a matter of processing. And you see this very hypothesis is recurring also in the topic of scalar implicatures and also other psycholinguistics domains, like, for instance, parsing or sentence revision, PP attachment, you name it, okay? So there's this idea that children, well, we know children's cognitive system is not mature yet. In fact, certain areas of the brain are developing until adolescence, especially the areas that are interesting for language processing, like Broca's area and stuff like this. So, and then there is a steep decline, right? So after your adolescence, you just keep on getting slower, basically. Sorry about that. So there is this idea that since children has limited processing resources, also involving extra linguistic processes like working memory, comparing different meanings, comparing different representations at the same time, deciding between different representations which are active at the same time, right? Given that they given that they have less processing resources compared to adults, then they struggle when they have to solve this complex task requiring a certain amount of processing, okay? So yeah, so this is often called processing limitation hypothesis. Given that children have limited processing resources, they do scope shift and scope inversion less often. They compute scalar implicature less often, and so on and so forth, okay? Right. So for instance, yeah, so the steps of this hypothesis works in this way. So for instance, let's start from the fact that children have a less mature working memory compared to adults. And then we need working memory for having a sentence revision, okay? What is working memory? Working memory is basically something that stores a high amount of information for a limited amount of time. So as you're processing a sentence, for instance, you might put the words that you hear in the so-called verbal working memory. So they're gonna just stay there, they're gonna be active there, and then you can perform operations on these words, like try out different orders or different constructions, okay? So as long as they are maintained active in the working memory, then you can work them out. When their memory track is decaying, then you cannot use them for language processing anymore. This is the idea. So along with this view, in order to have scope inversion, okay, you need to operate a sentence revision, which means that you first derive surface scope, okay, for instance, this logical form, and then you apply scope shift after you have this primary interpretation. And in order to do this, you have to perform a revision, right? So which basically means take these parts and modify it and get something else instead of it, right? A revised version involving inverse scope. And yeah, and that's it. And if you have something that facilitates you to do this job, like for instance, some contextual facilitation, right? Then you are going to be quite likely able to do it, even if you're a child. If nothing helps you out, This process is costly, right? It requires you to keep this representation in some sort of working memory while you're working it out, and it requires to perform this revision. And we know that sometimes children fail at doing this, right? Children struggle at revising their initial parse. And there is a nice experiment that found this. Maybe I'm going to put this paper as well. It's called the kindergarten effect. Okay. My anomia does not let me remember the author. Yasu, can you help me? Kindergarten path effect. Okay, I'll tell you later. So yeah, so then and this is quite similar to what we chatted about last time. So that when you had the frog on the napkin in the box, right? Basically, the kindergarten parting effect was to find out that young children struggled at revising their initial commitment about the assignment, for instance, of the PP attachment, right? So when they would interpret the sentence as put the frog on the napkin, then they cannot revise their initial assumption that the napkin was the destination of the verb put and not the modifier of the frog. They just would stick to their interpretation. Whereas adults, when they find on the box, they would understand that actually, put the frog on the napkin in the box. Yeah, when they find in the box, they would manage to revise their initial assumption. Okay. Okay. Oh my God, my anomia.
J.C. Truswell says the
Truswell, yes. Yeah, Bob Truswell and colleagues. Okay. No, Bob Truswell is the linguist. The other one. Okay. Anyways.
John
Truswell. Right, from UPenn. Thank you. Okay, so you see there's a lot of factors going on. And I tell you that we haven't found any final answers to this problem. So it's really an open problem, okay? But we have found some interesting at least hints as to what could actually influence scope ambiguity resolution and scope shift, as well as processing of implicatures. So right, so our question was, how can we investigate this issue, right? How can we investigate the impact of prosody on processing limitation and preference versus access on the interpretation of sentence involving all and negation? So one of the first idea we had was to pre-record the sentences in order to control intonation, okay? So in all these previous experiments, the intonation wasn't controlled. So it's really, as I showed you in our true value judgment task experiment, the experimenter would just utter the sentence with the intonation that he or she believes to be more natural, right? Now, the problem is that these things are so variable within people on the production side and on the comprehension side, okay? So one of the possible problems about these old experiments is that if your experimenter happened to be one guy that for some reason had a inverse scope preference or an inverse scope intonation preference, then he would express all these sentences with the same intonation, right? Now, probably Litz and Mussolini would say, no, Daniele, you are saying a lot of stupid things. We controlled intonation. We made sure that our experimenters, you always use the same intonation pattern, right? Yes, and I would reply, I don't believe you because even I cannot remember the intonation pattern that I used yesterday, right? So I don't even trust my own judgments. I don't even trust what I say. I don't even trust my intonation. So the only way to make sure that these things are controlled is to record them and have them on track. right? And also when you present them, to actually use, to make sure that you are using the same recording. Okay, good. Okay, so right, so this was the example that I told you about the head contour. Okay. Can anyone try to read this sentence with a head contour? Is there any volunteer? German speaking?
Ja,
Yes.
okay. Alle
Please.
Piraten sind nicht auf das Schiff zurückgekehrt.
Very good. Whereas this one?
Alle Piraten sind nicht auf das Schiff zurückgekehrt.
Right. So see, it's interesting that you also put some stress on shift, right? And here you put a prominent stress on alle, whereas what I really notice about this one is not just the raising tone on alle, but the de-stressing of the last part of the sentence, right? This, I think, is the most important feature of this kind of intonation profile. It's also common across languages, is a de-stressing of the last part of the sentence. And we are going to talk about it. Thank you. Right, so instead of using these intonation patterns, which would bias this sentence towards a surface scope intonation or towards an inverse scope intonation, we decided to use a unbiased, relatively neutral as much as we could intonation profile, which would be like this. So we added a mild accent on Piraten, no accent on alle, no accent on nicht, and a mild accent on Schiff, just to make the sentence a little bit more natural, okay? Something like alle Piraten sind nicht auf das Schiff zurückgekehrt. Now, I will play this sentence for you when we're back, so you will actually hear exactly the kind of sentence we use, okay? And yeah, and basically our key scenarios are exactly the kind of scenarios we've been talking about in all these classes. So we have what we call the none scenario, where no of the pirates have a beard, and the null scenario, or the some scenario, where not all but some of them have a beard, okay? And again, this scenario is compatible with both interpretation. This scenario is only compatible with Intrascope. Good. So the last question that we have to address is like, how can we investigate the issue of preference versus access? How can we be sure that the response of the participants is due to the fact that they really had the access to one interpretation rather than preferring it over the other one, right? So what our tentative solution to this question was exactly this. In most of the experiments involving a choice between the two scenarios, you are usually making people choose between two possibly true scenarios, right? Whereas this is more like a visual word eye tracking study. So this, in psycholinguistic terms, is called distractor or false competitor, okay? It represents a situation in which the sentence is false because all the pirates have a beard here, right? So the idea was to compare a false scenario to a true scenario and see when and how frequently our participants would figure out that this is false and this is true. So it's kind of forcing you to pick this scenario even if you don't like it particularly, because you are comparing with one which is really false, right? This was kind of the idea. So if you, right, So this, in a way, let us address the question which interpretation is accessed, because if you manage to pick this scenario against this one, you are gonna access one of these two interpretations. And if you pick this scenario against this one, you are gonna access this interpretation, okay? But compared to a simple true value judgment task where you are using only one scenario, the advantage of this task is that by recording eye movements and or reaction times, but of course eye movement is much better, we can also answer the question, which one of these scenarios is easier to access? And from that, we can have some idea about which kind of this representation is easier to access. Okay. And then we can also test the issue about the preference by comparing the two possibly true scenarios. Okay. And then we can, you know, we can have this with this hypothesis, with this working hypothesis, which is if children strongly prefer surface scope, we accept them. We expect them to choose this scenario because this is the only one compatible with surface scope. So this comparison cannot really tell us, right, which reading they prefer of this sentence, but it's rather about providing a control baseline on which scenario they prefer, right? Of course, if everyone prefers this scenario, then we are strongly confident that, if everyone prefers this scenario, then we are strongly confident they have a surface scope preference. But if everyone prefers this scenario, then we cannot really conclude that they have an inverse scope preference because this scenario is also compatible with inverse scope, right? Do you follow me on this point? Good. So we have to consider this condition, you know, carefully. All right. So what are we gonna predict about this issue of online processing and how processing limitation hypothesis could affect the online reference resolution, okay? Or the online disambiguation. So eye movement recording. So we are recording the eye movement of our participants. And what we are specifically interested in is the moment in time at which they will figure out that this is a false scenario, that the sentence in this scenario is false, and then they switch from this scenario to this scenario, right? Or in a more correct terminology, they will switch their preference, or they will develop a preference for the true scenario. So this moment in time is very important in eye tracking, and it's called the moment at which it happens, reference resolution or sentence disambiguation. So at the very beginning of an eye tracking experiment, you are basically looking at both scenarios, right? Your eyes are jumping back and forth from both scenarios. And if you average across all the subjects, you're going to probably find a 50% preference for either scenario. But then when you hear the sentence, when you interpret the sentence, and when you find out what it means, then you realize that this is actually the right scenario for the sentence. So you develop a preference. Okay? So by comparing what happens in these two different contexts, we can, in these two different conditions, we can draw some interesting conclusions, right? For instance, if it is true that you derive surface scope first, then we would expect a faster disambiguation for this scenario against the false one compared to this scenario, because this scenario is compatible with surface scope. So you first interpret surface scope. Surface scope interpretation access to your consciousness. You are aware of that, and you develop a preference for this scenario. Here, you will have to wait for some more time because you need to derive scope shift and inverse scope. You need to apply scope shift to the surface scope representation and get the inverse scope as a result. Okay. So if this is true, we have a strong prediction that this scenario is going to be more rapidly disambiguated compared to this scenario. If you have parallel access to both interpretations, a very, very compatible outcome would be that you have equally rapid disambiguation in both scenarios, okay? And of course, there might be other factors to play a role. There might be your preference for guys with a beard, your preference for this kind of scenario, right? So you have to consider all these other factors. Yeah. So I think, so yeah, I will just tell you some notions about the experimental structure and we take a short break, okay? So we ran these experiments with 45, I guess we even got to 46, 4 or 5 year old German speaking children at the kindergarten and 50 adult controls. When we say adult controls, what we actually mean is desperate university student looking for money. Okay, that's really important. As you know, as each of one at some point probably have been. Right. So you know, we call them adults, but actually, usually they are young adults like us. Probably more young like you, between 18 and 26, 30 years of age, okay? So that's important to consider. Because, I mean, it's, you know, it's probably, we know that, you know, processing of language processing is always sort of evolving. And so, for instance, if you're running experiments, and you have some subjects who are above 50, maybe it's not a great idea because they might actually increase the variance in your data because maybe they are slower at reading or slower at processing things. Okay, so you know, as a general rule, it is important to try to constrain as much as you can your group of participants. So it's good to have as other controls people that are within a kind of restricted range of age. Okay. And then we had 16 items or 16 trials in 3 experimental conditions plus 4 fillers. So we had 4 trial per condition. Okay. And the condition we had are exactly the one I told you about. So we had this surface or inverse scope access condition, where you have the non-scenario, which is both compatible with surface and inverse scope, compared to a false scenario. We have an inverse scope access condition, where you have the not all but some scenario compared to a false scenario, and then you have a preference condition, where you compare a non-scenario to a not all but some scenario. Okay? Again, just the stuff we talked about. So, yeah. I think we could take a break now. And so now you see the slides, right? Yeah. So we have these 3 experimental conditions with which you might be familiar now. And now I'll tell you something about the procedure, okay? So the procedure is a little bit different from what you have seen in the true value judgment experiment, control experiment. So the idea was to have a fictional setup with 2 groups of factors, which actually interpret pirates in the scene, and they must act as sort of a theater play, or rather like a game, okay? So the story was really about these 2 groups of pirates having some fancy adventures on a fantastic island. And then there was a boss of the theater which was not present in the scene, which was calling the experimenter on the phone, okay? So every time, at every trial, the experimenter was picking up the phone, there would be like a ringing tone, the experimenter would answer, and the pirate, the voice of the pirate would be heard by the child and by the participants, and the pirate would utter the critical sentence. And then the experimenter would ask the child whether, so which group of participants did the thing that the boss of the theater asked for. So basically, which group of participants behaved better? Which group of participants was better acting with respect to the sentence they heard, okay? And what they had to do was to put a coin in a coin box, put in front of both groups of participants. Now, the question is, are 4 or 5 children going to understand the task? Or they're just going to answer basically based on their preference, for instance, based on their preference with respect to what the pirates did. So in order to make sure that the participants understood the task, we had the so-called training phase, where we did not use the experimental sentence, but we just use a very, very simple sentence, usually including just a definite determiner, like the pirates fell from the ship. Right? So one group of pirates would fall from the ship, the other group would not fall from the ship, and then we asked the participants, okay, give the coin to the pirates who did the right thing. And the sentence uttered by the boss was, the pirates fell from the ship, right? So if they managed to give the coin to the right group of participants, it means that they understood the task. If they did not do that, we would explain them again, and we would go over the procedure again with the child until the child will understand this, okay?
But sorry, but isn't there like an element of peer pressure when you do it that way?
Of pressure, sorry?
Of peer pressure? So the children would copy what the other children do? Or is it just
right? Sorry,
just one child at a time?
One child at a time.
Oh, okay, okay.
You know, these experiments, you really want to investigate one child at a time, because yes, you're right. That would be a very, very bad confound, right? Also, we sometimes when we run these experiments, the mothers were also present in the experiment, so we made sure that the mother basically was not influencing the child, right? And possibly was not looking at the child. So oftentimes we put the mothers on the couch and the child not facing the mother, so he would not see what the mother was basically doing, right? Right. Okay. So let's have a look at the critical scenarios. So now let's move from beard to chief example, okay? So the sentence now was, all the pirates did not go back to the ship. And this was a critical item. So in this item, they met these mermaids, okay? And these mermaids here, I mean, both the group of pirates were offered by the mermaids to stay on the fantastic island forever. And these pirates here, they told the mermaids, look, thanks so much for the offer. This is amazing. Yes, we're going to stay living in the island forever. Whereas these pirates here, they said, look, we want to go back to our families. Thanks so much for the offer, but we cannot stay, okay? So, and they would see the whole story acted out with toys, and the eye tracker was put physically in the middle of this experimental table, okay? So the stories were not projected on a computer, but they were acted out with real toys. The children would see the whole developing of the story acted out with toys and explained by the experimenter, and then they would have to give a coin to one of the groups of pirates, okay? Next time I'm going to show you the video of this. Sorry, I couldn't find the video today. So this is just depicts the final outcome of the story. and that's when the boss would call on the phone, and when we play this trick of playing with the computer the sentence uttered by the boss. Okay, and the sentence would be: all the pirates did not go back to the ship. Alle piraten sind nicht auf das Schiff zurückgekehrt. Okay, so the picture on the left depicts a scenario which is true under both interpretations, because in this picture, no pirates went back to the ship. Okay, so it is true that all of the pirates did not go back to the ship, that all of the pirates are such that they didn't go back to the ship, and it's also true that not all of them went back to the ship, in fact, none. Whereas here it's false, because all of them went back to the ship. So there's no way this sentence can be true. Sorry, no way the sentence can be true in this scenario. And the other scenario, in a different condition, right? So they would only see one condition for each story. So in one list, the participants saw this particular condition in this particular story. In another list, they saw this other condition in this particular story. And this is the inverse scope access condition, because again, if they manage to provide the correct choice and choose this group of pirates, it means that they adopted inverse scope, because this scenario is only true with the inverse scope interpretation, which says that not all the pirates went back to the ship. In fact, these 3 of them went back to the ship, but these 2 of them stayed on the island with the mermaid. Okay, again, compare to the same whole scenario. Some of you might ask, yeah, but what if children prefer the red pirates? Because maybe they prefer red, right? Or maybe they prefer the pirates on the right for some crazy reason. So the trick to balance this potential confounding factor out is to always rotate your X conditions through every trial, and to switch for instance, to balance, so that in half of the trials, the green pirates were depicting the potentially true scenario, and in half of the trials, the red pirates would be depicting the potentially true scenario. Okay, and in other lists, you just invert the conditions. So those conditions in which the red pirates were depicting the potentially true scenarios are going to go to the green pirate, right? So when you average out of all participants, you're going to balance out these factors. Okay, this is very important. Okay, so this is inverse scope access, and then you have a preference condition where you have the non scenario and the not all scenario compared exactly one against each other. Okay, and again, we talked about that. Good. So let's see some predictions under the processing limitation hypothesis, and given what we know from previous studies. Okay, so we know that both children and adults access both interpretations. So we might find a facilitation effect for surface scope, meaning that they would display higher accuracy in the condition compatible with surface scope. Or maybe, yeah. Sorry, no, maybe. This is it. This is the prediction. As well as in the preference condition, we might predict that children have a surface scope preference based on the previous studies, whereas the adults would have an inverse scope preference or no preference at all. Maybe because the specific intonation of the sentence would not have them developing a specific preference for inverse scope, which is what was found in other experiments. So, yeah, so, you know, quite simple predictions from previous experiments. What about the processing? Well, if the processing limitation hypothesis is true, that assumes that the first interpretation that you adopt is a surface scope, and that suggests or supports the hypothesis that the surface scope is going to be accessed more quickly, because it is the first that you adopt. It is the one that you need in order to derive inverse scope. So it is the first available. All right? Yeah. So, quite simple predictions. And let's have a look at the offline results, okay? So now we are going to be interested in the rate of correct responses in the access conditions, okay? So this side of the graph depicts the correct responses in the non condition, the one that is compatible with surface scope, and this is gonna depict the responses in the inverse scope condition, the one that is compatible only with inverse scope, okay? Access conditions. Something that I haven't told you is that the adults have done this experiment in a computerized version. And in that version, we decided to have them rejection options. So to be able to say, I don't like any of these two scenarios, I don't think that any of the two groups of pirates did the right thing, okay? And we did not allow children to do that because we didn't want to introduce an additional complexity to the experiment, given that their age was quite young. Okay, so yeah, so what you see with adults is that they've been accurate in a lot of trials. So the wrong responses when they picked the context where all the pirates did something was actually very low, so very good. But you can see that they had way more rejections in the inverse scope scenario, right? So, I mean, not way more, 10% more rejection, and 13% more rejection and 10% less correct responses, and that was significant. Okay, so this is already an interesting result. It tells us that for some reason they were more accurate in the condition that is compatible with both interpretations. So just from this, we might infer that adults did not like the inverse scope interpretation so much with this specific intonation and with this specific scenario, okay? But we are going to check that later. Well, I mean, in fact, we are going to check that with the preference condition, which tells us exactly how many times they prefer the surface scope and how many times they prefer the inverse scope scenario, okay? I'm going to loosely call it surface scope scenario, but bear in mind that it's compatible with both interpretations. And you see that, interestingly, they showed a stronger preference for the surface scope scenario. So this is already quite unpredicted, given what we knew from other experiments where they had a strong preference for the inverse scope scenario. Okay. So yeah, surface scope preference and facilitation. So we talk about preference when we are considering the preference scenario, and facilitation when we talk about the access scenario, the accuracy in the access scenario when there is only one possibly true answer. Okay. Is this clear at this point? If you don't understand any detail of this, please interrupt me and ask me. Okay. It is very important that you understand things now. All right. So what did children do? Surprise, surprise. They were more accurate in the inverse scope scenario and less accurate in the surface scope scenario. Very significant. And also confirmed by their preference data, where they had a mild preference for the inverse scope scenario. Right? You see that, right? This is exactly the opposite pattern compared to adults. They didn't have the rejection options. So we have to be careful when we compare this data, right? But the pattern is quite clear. Yeah, so inverse scope preference and facilitation. All right, what about age? So in order to explore the effect of age, if you have enough participants, something useful is to do what we call a median split. So you take the median age of your group and you split your group of participants into two subgroups, the younger and the older, right? Which roughly corresponded in this experiment to 4 and 5 year olders. All right, so let's see what happens with age. If you take the participants that are older than 62 months, right? Same effect. If you take the younger participant, more errors, which is completely expected, but very, 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 very similar pattern. So both young and older children had displayed a mild inverse scope preference. So if you remember, I mentioned an experiment where they found that younger children provided more inverse scope answers. We did not find this in this experiment, okay? They were quite consistent across age. Okay. So let's look at the preference. Again, even in the preference condition, the responses were quite similar. So this is not really a deciding factor. So what we did now was to ask ourselves, okay, so let's see if there is a group of our participants who overall behaved quite well. They provided systematically a good amount of correct answers. And let's see if there is a group of participants who systematically failed in at least one of the two conditions, okay? So what we did was to consider to set up a threshold of 3 out of 4 correct responses in both conditions. And if we did this, out of our 45 subjects, we excluded 17 and we were left with 28 subjects, okay? Now we are wondering, now what we are really asking ourselves is, what's going to happen in the good comprehenders? Are they still going to show this asymmetry between surface scope and inverse scope or not? No, no asymmetry whatsoever. 2/3 of our participants, right? Roughly 2/3 did not have any effect, any facilitation effect for the surface scope scenario, which means that this asymmetry was due to the poor comprehender, okay? And again, if you look at these children who answered the majority of trials correctly, no preference as well. So this is consistent and interesting. So, entering conclusion, we expected that both groups would access both interpretation, and we found that both groups have to access both interpretations. Good. We expected a surface scope facilitation in children, and we found an inverse scope facilitation in children and a surface scope facilitation in adults, right? We expected a surface scope preference, and we find a mild inverse scope preference in children. We expected an inverse scope preference with adults, and we found a surface scope preference in adults, and no preference in the good comprehenders. So this is cool, right? When you find stuff that you were not expect, it means that there is room for discussion and for hypothesizing what went wrong or what went to the direction that was not predicted. So why did this happen, right? So again, children access both interpretation with unbiased prosody, but we found improved comprehension in the condition that supports the inverse scope, okay? Why? So I haven't really told you about this, but maybe now it's the time to tell you something about this, okay? So if you think about the inverse scope interpretation, So all the pirates didn't go to the ship, meaning not all the pirates went back to the ship. From the very first class, some of you told me that this sentence literally means that some of the pirates went back to the ship. And then we had this long discussion suggesting that actually not all is compatible with none, right? And then I told you, yeah, but you know, this is tricky. We're going to talk about that. The way we interpret a sentence with not all, with the negation of universal quantifier, strongly suggests that at least some of the individuals did what the predicate says, right? So where does this suggestion come from? The idea is this is an implicature. So I haven't told you what implicatures are, but the idea is that, no, yeah, I did tell you what implicatures are, right? So I didn't tell you how to derive this particular implicature, right? And this is going to be a topic of the next classes, but the idea is that when you interpret a sentence like not all the pirates went back to the ship, you derive this implicature that says that at least some of them went back to the ship. Okay. And this is very important because this very implicature is the only thing that would make you prefer this context over this context in case you adopt an inverse scope interpretation. Because logically, we have seen that the inverse scope interpretation is compatible with both these contexts. So if there is one thing that is going to make you pickier and more happy with this kind of context, it can only be this implicature. Or you might say that there is a natural association by using a not all sentence and this kind of context in the real world, right? But this is just another way to frame the idea that you do some sort of pragmatic inference on that, whether it's due to the probability of associating a context with a form or with a meaning, or whether if it's due to a logical computation that you did, doesn't really matter. It's really some sort of like extra linguistics or higher level linguistic inference that you make with respect to an interpretation. Okay.
Maybe we can say that.
So yeah. So this was our guess. If anything, the only thing that might make you prefer this context over this one, providing you adopted inverse scope interpretation, is that there is an implication. Okay. So possible explanation. Right, but then, you know, someone might say, yeah, but are children any good at deriving scalar implicatures? And they're not really good, but some people found that they are kind of better at doing this particular implicature arising from the combination of negation and universal quantifier, which are called indirect implicatures. Okay, so yeah, maybe this is pointing to the right direction, but we don't know yet. Good. So do online data support this explanation? And what are the online data telling us? So that's the big question. And this is the first graph that we are going to look at, okay? Now, I don't think you're very familiar with this kind of graphs. So I will explain you now what these kind of graphs mean. So this is called target preference graph, okay? And the target preference is a very useful index in this kind of eye tracking experiment because it tells you exactly at what time during the online unfolding of the sentence, during the online presentation, people develop a preference for the target. In this experiment, the target was the correct scenario in the access conditions, okay? So either this scenario or this scenario compared to the false scenario. Now, like I told you, at the very beginning of this sentence, of the experiment, when you haven't heard the sentence yet, you are probably going to look back and forth towards both scenarios because you don't know which one is the right one. And as you hear the sentence, at some point in time, you're going to have like a sort of a eureka moment and you're going to be, oh, yes, that is the right scenario that I want to pick. That time corresponds to when this line, this target preference line, departs from the 0.5 chance level and increases towards 1. So when it goes to 1, you are only fixating the target. If it goes to 0, you are only fixating the distractor. If it's about 0.5, you don't have any preference. And the obvious way to compute this index is to take the percentage, the proportion of fixation to the target, and divide it by the total amount of fixation to both the target and your distractor scenario. Okay? Is this clear? This is very important. And we are going to look at graphs like this over and over. So you see, in this graph, the pivotal moment is right this one. At about 1 second from the onset of Ale. No. Of Nicht, sorry, of Nicht. Okay? So here they heard alle. So alle Piraten haben nicht. As you hit nicht, you start composing nicht with alle, and you start developing a meaning in your mind associated to this sentence. Okay? And if this interpretation is gonna push you to the target, it means that it's the right interpretation. And as you can see from the graph, now you are comparing what happened in the none condition to what happened with the null condition, right? And you see that the target preference increases more rapidly in the none condition. So in the condition compatible with surface scope, especially after 1 second, you have this difference, which is significant for 100 milliseconds time being. So these are analyses computed on 100 milliseconds time being. And when you see this little thing, it means that there is a significant difference between two conditions. Okay? Whereas this is whether one condition is significantly different from chance. Okay? So you see, the blue line is significantly different from chance at about 1 second. The red line is significantly different from chance at about 1.7 seconds. And at about 1.5 seconds, you have a significant effect of condition. Okay? And then again, you're going to find this effect later again, not significant anymore. But this gives you some idea that actually there was a processing advantage for the condition compatible with surface scope. Good. So this was children, right? Did I write it anywhere? Did I write it anywhere? No. Okay. Sorry about that. And this is adults. So you see that things are rather different. So with adults, you have a very, very, very comparable disambiguation profile, very comparable curves, right? At about 1 second, you are identifying the target in both conditions, kind of at the same pace. There is a little bit of a difference, right? But you see this difference is also present in the baseline and it's not significant. So if it's not significant, there's not much you can tell about that. But some cool things happen at about 2 seconds, where you see that in the surface scope condition, this preference decreases. So it is as if the participants, in a way, became confused again, or became the uncertainty about the interpretation that the participants adopted increased after an initial disambiguation, whereas in the inverse scope condition is kind of remain steady and then just decrease much later in time. Okay, so a very late decrease is compatible with the fact that participants already made their choice, pressed the button, and they were done. Okay, whereas a decrease that happened before that might index some certain processes going on in their mind, like, for instance, second thoughts, or another interpretation that could just pop up in the mind and affect the online behavior. Okay. Anyways, let's compare this graph again. This is the children. Advantage, early advantage preference for the surface, for the condition compatible with surface scope. Adults, no such effect, and if anything, a later effect showing facilitation for the inverse scope condition. Is this clear? Please ask me question if there is anything that is not clear. Anything. Don't worry about asking stuff. I'm more worried when you do not ask stuff. Okay. So should I move on? Okay. So as you might have noticed, for once, the fact that surface scope was disambiguating more quickly was compatible with our predictions, right? In children. And but the late processing advantage for, and also processing advantage for inverse scope, is not too shocking with respect of adults, because we know that they actually have usually a preference for inverse scope. But within this experiment, it is surprising, but because they did not have a preference for inverse scope interpretation. Okay, so what we are witnessing here is a dissociation between their preference and their access, and a dissociation between the offline judgments and the online behavior. And that's interesting. Right. So to wrap up, we found faster access in children for this condition. We suggest that either surface scope is really computed first, or that something is computed in this condition which slows things down, for instance, an implicature. Okay. So if we only look at children, right, we see that, in fact, they were kind of good at interpreting these sentences, but we found this split pattern of results where they had a faster disambiguation for the surface scope, but they displayed a higher accuracy for the inverse scope. Okay. We have that there is no real effect of age, but we found an effect of consistency in the good responders. So those who were accurate were in both conditions did not show any difference with respect to surface scope and inverse scope. Those who struggled actually struggled much less with inverse scope. And this is surprising. So how can we reconcile these results? Faster access from online data and higher accuracy in offline data, right? So one of the obvious conclusions is that we know that the derivation of an implicature that gives you the not all but some interpretation only happens with the inverse scope condition. So maybe deriving that implicature might have provided a facilitation to the pool comprehenders. And we call that pragmatic hook hypothesis or pragmatic boost. So that when you do derive this implicature, it's going to sort of help you to perform the task and to identify the right scenario. Even though you actually computed surface scope first. Or maybe surface scope is not computed first at all. And the computation of the implicature just takes time. And it explains why the disambiguation in this scenario is delayed. Okay? So, right. So once again, the interesting pattern that we want to explain is precisely this, right? So why do children show this effect in processing facilitation for the condition that is compatible with surface scope? And they show this effect in their offline choices in the same condition. So a strong facilitation for the inverse scope compared to the surface scope. Okay? Which is mainly due to the pool comprehenders, because the good comprehenders were at ceiling in both conditions. So yeah, the final answer to this question is not known, right? But our best guess is this, which is basically that there is a processing advantage for surface scope because it is structurally more simple, or because it's really computed first. And then there is something going on which facilitates the final choice, especially in the pool comprehenders, in the inverse scope condition. And this thing could be an implicature. So an alternative explanation would be that, for instance, for some reason, children prefer a scenario in which some of the pirates did something compared to a scenario where none of the pirates did what they were supposed to do. Okay? You might say it's not really about something specific to the interpretation of this sentence. It's a more general effect of the visual scenario, of the visual content. Okay? For some reason, our subjects had a preference for this kind of content. And now I'm going to tell you, okay, but according to this explanation, then you have to tell me why this facilitation effect only showed up in the offline choices and not in the online choices, and not in the online effects, and not in the online behavior. So if for some reason there is a scenario or a structure of the scenario that you prefer or that you are more familiar with, then you would really expect that you are both faster and more and at the same time more accurate in judging that scenario. But then again, that's not what we found. So you might say the same thing about this scenario. You know, maybe this was faster to process. That's why they show a processing advantage in this condition and not in this condition. But then the same counter argumentation can be made, right? So you might say, okay, if you think that this scenario is faster to process, then why was it more difficult to judge? Why were children less accurate in this scenario? And then there is an alternative explanation that could be, you know, maybe your unbiased intonation was not really unbiased, but was biasing participants for one or the other interpretation. Okay. But then again, the same reasoning can apply. If our intonation bias participant towards a surface scope interpretation, then we expect to find processing and better understanding in this condition. If our intonation biased our participants towards an inverse scope interpretation, and that's why we found an inverse scope facilitation in the offline judgments, then you would also expect an online processing facilitation, right? So neither of these simple explanation based on visual preference or intonation biasing would unproblematically account for our split pattern of results. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, to conclude, we found evidence that children do surface scope. We found this effect that actually poor comprehenders were facilitated in the inverse scope condition. That was very surprising, right? Not extremely surprising, because we have seen that also in previous studies, some strange effects showing that younger participants developed a preference for inverse scope. So that's not completely surprising, right? But what is intriguing is that this inverse scope superiority effect did not show up in the online processing. If anything, in the online processing, there was facilitation for the surface scope. Okay. So I guess this is enough for today. And also we're running out of time. So please have a look at these slides again, which I'm going to post. Think about this. And if you have any questions, or if there is something that you haven't understood, or if there is something that bothers you, ask me next time. Okay. And I will write you, and I will post the papers in the pool, and specifically I will talk to the people that want to present next week. Okay. And I'm going to stay here for a few more minutes. So if you have any specific question about anything, I'm going to be here. Okay.
Bye.
See you next time then.
Yep.
Bye.
Hi. Bye-bye.